Monster Hunter World was one of the best games of 2018, a year stacked with many popular titles. This was the first time it was available on consoles outside of Japan since the first Monster Hunter released back in 2004 for the PS2. And boy was this a welcomed arrival. Personally, I started my Monster Hunter journey on the 3DS with Monster Hunter 4U. Even with the steep learning curve and limitations of the handheld graphical potential, I instantly fell in love with the game. I have clocked in several hundreds of hours for both Monster Hunter 4 and Monster Hunter Generations. Sadly, Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate, or XX, didn't release outside of Japan, so I wasn't able to play it. I always felt that Monster Hunter, while being extremely fun on the handheld console, was severely limited from achieving its potential. It was great that I could play the games on my train commute to school, but having my hands curled up for an hour did cause pain, even on the 3DS XL. So when I heard the news of a Monster Hunter game coming to a household console, I was very pleased. Monster Hunter was going to get a chance to live up to its potential. Just knowing that the gameplay style on the 3DS was coming to a controller was already very exciting, let alone all the graphical upgrades and processing power. It's safe to say that Monster Hunter World was one of the games I was looking forward to in 2018. It was one of the few games that I actually pre-ordered. Now if any of you have read my channel description, you would know that I am in crippling debt. And that wasn't any different back in 2018. So pre-ordering a game is quite a statement, from me at least. Now enough rambling on about my financial crisis. Let's look at what made Monster Hunter World such an anticipated game for Monster Hunter fans, and if it lived up to that potential I saw back on the 3DS. The Monster Hunter series has always been a complex series to get into for new players. With a steep learning curve which incorporates the different aspects of the game, such as the 14 different weapon systems, all with their own movesets, multiple armor sets, and I'm not even going to get into mix sets yet, items to take into the hunt, such as healing wear, whetstones, rations, traps, paintballs. You guys get the point. As a new player, this series can be very overwhelming, giving you a tidal wave of information that smashes your body against the rocks, and it's not even well explained. So, the first problem when taking a game with so much legacy information on a not so mainstream handheld console and bringing it to a mainstream household console is how to get new players acquainted with all the mechanics of the game and enjoying it rather than feeling like they're studying for a test. By no means is this an easy task if you want new players to keep playing your game and not feel overwhelmed by the tidal wave of information. And you can see that Capcom really did think about this problem and try to resolve it. Rather than throwing the player into the game assuming that they had already played the previous 9 or so games and that everyone who purchased a copy was already a G-rank hunter, Capcom made sure that Monster Hunter World was accessible to the new player, which was going to be the majority of buyers outside of Japan. Here Capcom did something different than with previous Monster Hunter games, and that is have a story. An actual story that has a beginning, middle, and end. Previous games in the series didn't have a structured story. There was a general idea of a hunter joining the Hunters Guild to hunt down wyverns, and that was pretty much it. There were some mandatory quests to progress you to the next rank, but they didn't connect to form an overarching story. Monster Hunter World changed this by having an actual story. Whether the story is good or not is besides the point. It's not that great. But what it does is act as an appropriate entry point for new players. It teaches basic movement and traversal mechanics, shows the sheer size of the monsters that we will hunt, and at the beginning gives a tour of the Research Commission headquarters, visits locations of importance, and introduces a lot of new concepts. This was aided by having voice acting, an easier way to receive new information than having to read paragraphs and paragraphs of text, which does appear later on in classic Monster Hunter fashion. What having an actual story achieves is giving structure for new players to follow, getting them familiar with Monster Hunter and easing them into the steep learning curve rather than dumping them in this vast world to fend for themselves. Players know which quest to complete next and how they should approach the quests, albeit in a rather unclear way. The new 3DS featured a gyroscope on the right side as well as the standard gyroscope on the left, allowing you to both move and look around. Playing Monster Hunter on it felt like playing on a controller, but due to the size and ergonomics of the 3DS, gaming on it for long hours did start cramping the hands. But with Monster Hunter World being on a household console that is played on an ergonomic controller, which is much better suited for long playing hours, the problem was going to be solved. The button layout was the same as on the 3DS games, but this time your hands didn't feel like they've got rigor mortis. Owing to the fact that the controller layout was practically the same, moving from the 3DS to the controller was easily achieved, and so the weapon combos and movesets were kept similar with a few additions. This was accompanied by controls being shown on the top right for beginner players who weren't familiar with the controls from previous games. And much of the other mechanics were also kept the same, such as the items, the kitchen, weapon upgrades, and so on. This meant familiarity to veteran hunters. In previous games, paintballs were used to track monsters, but these were replaced by scout flies, which guide the player to monster tracks and then lead to finding the adequate number of tracks, and this gave the scout flies enough information to guide you to the location of the monster. This was a mechanic introduced to Monster Hunter World for the newer players to help them through the hunt, but felt a bit condescending to players more familiar with the game, and hindered immersion as scout flies would guide you to the tracks and then to the monster. It would have been better to have an option to turn the scout fly mechanic off and use the environment without the aids to locate monsters and have certain monster fleeing patterns which would be used to find a monster again after it had fled, like in previous games. The staple of the Monster Hunter series was making you feel that these creatures were alive, living in harsh conditions which you have to overcome and master to be successful in your hunt. Each monster has its own behavior pattern, shown in the way it responds to danger and the way it fights back against the hunter. This gives each monster a unique feeling during the hunt. On the 3DS, monsters looked pretty good, considering that this was on a handheld device. The true size of the wyverns were captured, aided by most of the areas in the game being somewhat open spaces which gave room for the monster to show their size. Monsters had unique color schemes for their hides or scales which added to their profile. Take all this and bump it up to the computing power and HD graphics of the PS4 and Xbox One, and the results were astonishing. From the ferocious nature of the Nergigante as it leaps around erratically to each side of the arena, to the violent digging of the Diablos as it swims around like a sand torpedo. These were all beautifully displayed, giving the feeling of fighting actual creatures. Monster Hunter World added the new monster-on-monster interaction, where randomly during a hunt another monster would appear and proceed to fight the monster you were hunting, or in the case of the Basilgors, indiscriminate carpet bombing. Monsters felt more alive than they had ever done, while keeping true to the Monster Hunter formula. This feeling was excellently transferred and enhanced by moving from the handheld to the household consoles. The map was changed. Monster Hunter World features one large area with multiple sub-areas that no longer require you to load from one section to the next, as opposed to the segmented areas in older games, which treated each segment as individual levels, having you load from one to the next. This gave a more seamless feel traversing through the jungle, desert, or coral, giving you the feeling of traveling from one location to another, trying to find or chase down the monster you are hunting. This wasn't the only change. As said before, sub-areas in previous games were usually open land, some landmarks, but now the world was filled with various fauna and flora, which gave a more immersive atmosphere while running around. Items were scattered around more naturally, with some even being interactable and giving benefits during the hunt, and monsters acted as if they were in their natural habitats, which you would have to exploit to slay these towering beasts. Toppling these beasts felt even better on the controller, with the vibration reaffirming that massive blow you land after bringing the monster close to exhaustion. And once you did slay them, all that beautiful, colourful hide was ready to be skinned, and other body parts waiting to be carved off. Just like every other Monster Hunter game, this could be used to make and upgrade weapons and armour, which you could use then to hunt some more monsters, and the cycle continues. But this does bring me onto the next point quite nicely: weapons and armour. Monster Hunter World, like the game before, has 14 different weapons, all with their own unique movesets and playstyles. Each had extensive upgrade paths as you'd expect from Monster Hunter games, requiring certain parts from different monsters to fully upgrade the weapons. Monster Hunter World added the ability to keep a checklist of the materials you needed to craft an item, which updated as you acquired them from playing the game, which was a very useful tool that didn't exist in previous games. It made farming for items easier as you see your progress during a hunt, rather than having to finish the hunt, go to the blacksmith, and then check the upgrade you wanted and how many more items you required. The upgrade paths were visually presented more clearly than they had been in previous games, showing you how many upgrades each path had from the beginning. Compared to the way it was before, where you would get one weapon and you would have to check online to see the upgrade paths, as the game only unlocked upgrades as you progressed through the game. This made choosing which path you wanted to complete something you could plan for from before. What was removed from Monster Hunter World from the previous game, Generations, was the hunting style, and hunting arts, special moves of sorts. But this did seem to be a unique part of the Generation games. Armor sets were always a major part of the previous games, creating two factions within the community: the purists, with their aesthetic-driven preaching of each piece of the armor being from the same set, and the blasphemous objective mix setters with their optimally mixed and matched builds. The move to household consoles has only furthered this divide, with better graphics truly capturing the beauty of the armor sets for the purists, and the gem system similar to that of decorations from previous games for the objectivists. But while the armor sets look amazing, there's still this layer of complexity associated with them, which has carried over. There are multiple armor sets, and sets which provide different stat boosts as the first layer of complexity. But then added to that are the ways in which armor sets and pieces can be mixed, adding another layer of complexity. And then decorations can be added to armor pieces, which also affects the standard resistances, but can also have multiple different, somewhat hidden stat effects, forming another layer of complexity. While all of this has been a staple of Monster Hunter for a long time, Monster Hunter World did try to simplify things by adding more description to the stat upgrades compared to previous installments, which did help. However, the sheer number of decorations and their subtle stat effects were still overwhelming, especially for newer players. As a whole, Capcom successfully transferred one of the core aspects of the series to Monster Hunter World, keeping true to the main Monster Hunter loop by giving players aesthetically pleasing armor sets as well as multiple weapon upgrades. However, the steep learning curve involved remained from the previous games without much solution to make it easier for players to understand. But this also offered more depth for the veteran hunters who at higher ranks get to mix and match many combinations of armor and decorations, enriching the playing experience and making sure there are a few hundred hours of content in the game to get through. One of the great aspects of Monster Hunter on the 3DS was the fact that DLCs were always free. Additional content at no extra cost. Something doesn't seem to be adding up here. The devs at EA are scratching their heads in confusion. But it's true. All DLC quests that were added throughout the lifetime of the game could be downloaded at no extra cost, meaning you got access to all the special events, collaborations, and rewards for free as long as the game was receiving updates. And in true Chad fashion, this was also Capcom's policy for Monster Hunter World. Free DLCs for the lifetime of the game. There was no need to purchase additional story content or the absolutely crucial camera mode, which wasn't added in the original game. Yes, I'm looking at you, Square Enix. Capcom released free DLC over a 1-year period, adding new events and monsters for players to hunt and craft gear from. And you could argue that Iceborne is a paid DLC for Monster Hunter World, but it really isn't a DLC in the strict sense, but equivalent to how 3DS games would get a first game like Monster Hunter 4 and then a Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. These added more monsters to the game, new locations, and really feels like a new game. Iceborne is an expansion pack, which makes the game feel new, with 27 additional, tougher, large monsters, making for a difficult experience for players who had already played the game for a while. A problem with all games that feature some sort of gameplay loop is the Overjustification Effect, and Monster Hunter is no different. A phenomenon where the intrinsic motivation to do an activity is diminished due to the extrinsic rewards offered for completing the activity. And when the intrinsic rewards are removed, the motivation to complete the action also goes, unless there's additional motivation offered. This phenomenon can be observed with a game like Monster Hunter. The intrinsic motivation for playing the game, because it is fun, is replaced by the extrinsic rewards, items from monsters to craft desired weapons and armor. But once you've completed all the armor sets and all the weapons that you desire, those extrinsic rewards have already diminished the pure fun you get from playing the game for its own sake. As there is nothing left for you to do, your justification for playing the game being to hunt this monster over and over to get this one specific item to make this one piece of armor is no longer a justification, and so you lose your motivation. In Monster Hunter World, there are multiple different playstyles to learn and master, which keeps the game fresh. Each playstyle requires you to approach hunts in a different way, and to learn the monster's patterns again. The game places a heavy emphasis on co-op play with friends or strangers, especially in the higher ranks and Iceborne, where quests require organized teams to complete the hunt. Playing with friends reinforces the intrinsic motivation for playing the game, having fun. But sadly, not everyone has friends. Besides that sad note about my lack of friends, Monster Hunter World does a good job of trying to keep your attention away from this problem and play the game for the sake of playing it. Monster Hunter has always been a very popular series in Japan, but outside of Japan it hasn't quite caught the attention of the market as it has in the East. Monster Hunter World being the first Monster Hunter game on the household console since the PS2 way back in 2004 was a game that could change that and set a new precedent for the Monster Hunter series in the West. In general, the Monster Hunter formula, which had worked well in Japan, has been kept the same, with some crucial changes and additions to Monster Hunter World to facilitate for the new players. This included the major addition of an actual story mode to introduce the main concepts of the game, and the sales of the game showed the success that Monster Hunter World has had in the West. Monster Hunter World, at the date of making this video, has sold 20 million copies of the game, with 70% of those copies being sold outside of Japan, being the most successful game that Capcom has released, selling 10 million more copies than the next best-selling Capcom game. The move from handheld consoles to household consoles has been very successful for Capcom. They've been able to attract many new players and moving out of Japan to worldwide popularity. The potential that I saw for this series on the handheld console way back on my commutes was taken to the next level when released on the more powerful household consoles. Just the push Monster Hunter needed to take over the Western player base, as it has done in the East. Thank you for watching my video. Stay safe and remember to get good.